Good afternoon. My name is Deanna Van Dyke, and on behalf of the Department of Geology, Geography, and Environment, I would like to welcome everybody here to these presentations. That's everybody who is here in person, and we also have people who are joining us on Zoom as well to watch these presentations. For some of you, you may not be familiar with the program that is putting on these presentations. The First Year Research in Earth Sciences, or FIRES, program brings first-year students into understanding science by doing science. And these students have been working on Dune research for the semester and focusing on specific projects for about the last 7 weeks of the semester. And so you're going to be able to hear the results of the research and how they got to those results in these presentations. Each presentation will take somewhere in the vicinity of 10 minutes. There will be some time for questions after each presentation. And if you can stay for some or for all of the presentations, you will have a nice progression through understanding some of the current topics that are affecting the dunes. So we invite you to be enthusiastic in your welcome of teams, and also to think of good questions to ask. And we just ask that you enjoy these presentations. So I will invite our first research team to come up and to tell you what they learned. Thanks for that. Our presentation is on dune slope stabilization after a period of severe wave erosion. My name is Cassie Demlo.
I'm Amira Ribbons.
My name is Abby Gustafson.
High wave and storm levels in Lake Michigan between 2018 and 2020 has caused severe erosion along the shoreline in the form of scarps. Dune scarps occur when high waves erode part of the dune closest to the water. The result is a near 90-degree cliff, as you can see in this photo from 2019 when erosion was ongoing. Water levels have since decreased along Lake Michigan, leaving many scarps like this one behind. These scarps have been changing, but not much research has been done on how or why. In this presentation, we will use the term Scarp Recovery to describe the process of scarps like this one returning to a form close to that of the foredune it was originally. Our study's goal was to find the effects on scarps after water levels fell, specifically hoping to find patterns and factors important to changes. Our listed objectives include determining scarp prevalence in our study areas, investigating their characteristics, and comparing our results with those of the previous study done in 2019.
For our study, we operated in the state of Michigan, along the coast of Lake Michigan in 2 areas. We did PJ Hoffmaster State Park and Rosie Mound Natural Area. We focused on the shoreline to mimic the 2019 study we will be comparing our results to. In our 3 pictures here, we can see 3 different dune sites at different beaches at our different lab periods where we collected data. In the first one, you can see how dune grass has fallen off of the scarp or dune formation. In the middle one here, we can see a lot of bare sand and visible striation there at the bottom here. And on the far right, we can see how tree roots and dune grass along the ridge here has created a sharp ridge due to its roots and collecting of sand. For our method, we attempted to answer 2 questions touched on in our research objectives. Have dunes recovered, and if so, how? For unbiased research, we started on a beach. We measured 20 meters along the beach to determine our dune sites that we would be studying. We took GPS coordinates at each site. Then we used the stadia rod and hand level to measure height and angle of slope, followed by notes of vegetation, human impacts, sand features, and 3 different photographs of each dune site from different angles. Data collection was then followed by a time of comparison between our 2 studies in terms of especially height and slope measurements.
For results, of the 65 sites we visited, 64 had this almost vertical region with exposed roots, and 64 had a gentle sandier slope beneath that. Throughout the sites, the height varied widely. It varied from 0.4 meters to 8 meters, with an average of 3.51 meters. The slope was more consistent. More than 90% of our data had a slope angle between 20 degrees and 40 degrees, with an average of 30 degrees. Looking at scarp characteristics, we found a pattern. Most of the scarps had dune grass on top, followed by exposed roots, and then a gentle sandier slope at the bottom. We compared our study to a Hoffmeister scarp study from 2019. In that study, the scarp height average was 1.14 meters, when in 2021, the average was 3.51 meters. Another way to look at this difference is to consider the classification system of 2019. They classified any scarp that was higher than 1.25 meters as a high scarp, and about 42% of their scarps were high scarps. Well, now in 2021, we found that 78% of our scarps classify as high scarps. The slopes have also changed significantly. In 2019, erosion was ongoing, so the slope was pretty much 90 degrees. Well, now the average slope is 30 degrees. These pictures demonstrate that very well. You can see in 2019, there's a sharp divide between the beach and the scarp. Well, now in 2021, there's a sort of slope or ramp at the bottom of the scarps, with some vegetation starting to grow on it. We've seen a significant change in both the height and the angle of slope since 2019. We were particularly surprised that the scarps seem to have grown since 2019. This could be due to the lowering lake level. This scarp shows how the lake level was very high in 2019, but has since begun to drop. Lowering lake levels create a wider beach, which gives the wind more sand that it can deposit on the scarps. Additionally, the stabilizing vegetation we noticed can help trap the sand and increase scarp height. Studying scarp recovery, we categorized it into 3 phases. In 2019, we saw lots of erosion and steep angles. Now in 2021, we're seeing some slope ramp formation. And we predict that if lake levels do not rise, they will go back to what they were before it was scarped, the beach was scarped, with a more consistent curve and vegetation throughout. This is a picture from before the scarping happened. You can see the curve of both the foredune and the dune ridge in the background.
Moving on to conclusions, we found that scarps in our study areas were still visible, but now have the addition of a distinct slope. The scarps we observed largely shared certain characteristics, including vegetation on top, visible roots on the scarp face, and slope deposition at the bottom. Current Hoffmeister scarps exhibit clear changes from those measured in 2019. They are higher with gentler scarp slopes and more vegetation. In conclusion, our study collected important information on scarp recovery, which will be helpful to know as this process continues.
We would like to give our thanks to our professor and our mentor, as well as the areas where we conducted our studies and their employees, but especially the Michigan Space Grant for providing funding. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
We do have time for questions. I'll ask the question. What was the biggest surprise that you had with your research?
I think we did not expect the scarps to grow in height. And we didn't actually suspect to see as much change as we did.
The other thing I think was just how clear the parallels between most of the scarps we measured were. That it was very, very like clear certain characteristics that were pretty much the same between like all of them.
I'd like to have a sample, a data set of 65 with 64 of them sharing similar characteristics. That's pretty impressive.
Question from the front here? No?
Why do you think that there was such a change in heights between the scarps during the 2 years?
One of our theories was that the scarps that have previously been measured were actually just completely gone, and we were measuring the dune ridge behind the original scarps, which would have been a lot higher. So we're looking at scarp motion, dune ridge. They were measuring this one. We were measuring the dune ridge behind it, possibly. It also could have been due to the lower lake levels, like she said. and just a lot of sand deposition.
Observe any change within the time of your study?
No, I think it was too short of a period to kind of change. All right, let's take this research. We will always have about a 1 minute or so transition while we get the next PowerPoint up and the next group comes up. In class, we're used to doing stretches when we have opportunities. So we'd encourage the guests in the back couple of rows to stand up and stretch while we're transitioning. And if you can get creative and make that stretch like straight as an arrow, like a scarf right now.
Yep. Yep. Good, thank you, Charlie. I like your shirt, bro.
I like yours.
Abstract shapes work well, don't they?
I have socks that are the exact same thing as your shirt.
Old Navy.
All right, we are ready for our second presentation. So in the first presentation, you were introduced to some activity right along the shoreline. This group is going to introduce you to a different type of dune. Let's welcome our second group of presenters.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sam Skillett. This is Levi Heisinger, Annika Boss, Catherine Gardner. Our presentation is going to be focusing on the differences in artificial and natural blowout. So in 2020, right as COVID started, the fires program looked as if it wasn't going to have much of a future. A lot of the transportation needed to get out to the lakeshore was not allowed considering all the COVID restrictions. So Deanna Van Dyke decided to build her own dune here on campus, just to the east of the Prince Conference Center. In 2021, just before this semester, more sand was added, as you can see here, to build an artificially constructed blowout dune.
So our study was specifically looking at how this dune compares to natural blowouts found, created, and shaped by natural forces. Before we get into the specifics of this study, I just want to give you a quick primer on what a blowout dune is. So as we all know, a dune is a pile of sand that's been shaped by wind. A blowout dune would be a pile of sand that's been shaped by wind in a specific shape, right? So that shape looks as this diagram shows you, is you've kind of got this parabolic trough, and it's sloped in the middle, and you've got arms extending out to the sides. And our research was specifically helpful in our context because in order to improve this dune for future classes, we need to understand specifically how the artificial dune is different from natural blowout dunes, and what steps we could take to make it resemble more the natural.
So our study area for this research was the Perseverance Conference Center Dune Blowout, and then also Kitchener-Lynquist Parker Dune Preserve. So the Perseverance Dune Blowout was our artificial blowout that was constructed, as Sam said, here on campus by Deanna Van Dyke in 2020. We had our natural blowouts from Kitchener-Lynquist Parker. We chose 3 blowouts that were of similar shape and size to Perseverance Dune, so that our data would be similar. We decided for our objective to compare sediment sizes of all 4 dunes, analyzing what the difference is between the artificial dune and the natural dune blowouts. We also decided to measure and compare the dune profile and defining features, also analyzing the difference between the artificial dune and the natural dune blowouts.
All right, so our methods. For selecting the 3 natural blowouts, similar to Perseverance Dune, we walked around Kitchener-Lynquist on our first lab activity. We focused kind of visually on the relative size and shape of the dunes at Kitchener-Lynquist, not really
very data reliant there, but we know from our previous knowledge of the approximate measurements of perseverance to try to find those readings. For measuring and comparing sediment sizes, we collected sand samples from both the bottom and crest of the dune, just surface samples, so right on top. And then we performed grain size analysis for that sample. And then for measuring and comparing dune features, we performed quadrat studies for vegetation. So you would take a little square and then throw it to count the variety and density of the vegetation there. And then we also measured the slope of blowouts on both the arms and the main line of the blowout. And then finally, we performed straight line surveys for all 4 dunes to see the dune profile. So here we have a map of the Perseverance dune blowout here on campus. You can see that the crest line makes a U shape in the blowout, and our dune is facing up north. And over here to the west, we have the Lake Michigan. As you can see, it's just like a patch of sand here on campus in Canada. This is Kitchelingus Harker Dune Preserve. This is our 3 natural blowouts. You can tell they're all within proximity of each other, and they're all of similar shape and size. This map is to scale compared to the map that was on the previous slide. This time you can see that our dunes are facing west towards Lake Michigan. And we also have that still crest line shape for the blowout. All right, so this is our results page. This is kind of a general overview of the differences between Perseverance, our artificial dune, and all of the natural dunes found at Kitchelingus. The surroundings, as mentioned before, Perseverance Dune is on campus, so it's right by the Prince Conference Center, which is a huge, like, block to wind. And then it's also found by a really big parking lot, which is not the case at all at Kitchelingus Harker Dune Preserve. It's just a bunch of patches of bare sand grass with a really nearby forest, and then the parking lot is a little ways away. You have to walk to get to all of the dunes that we observed. Proximity to Lake Michigan was another different factor. Perseverance Dune is about 64.4 kilometers from Lake Michigan, whereas Kitchelingus is only 0.4 kilometers, so it's right near the lake shore. And then Perseverance Dune measured at about a 5 centimeter change in erosion per week, whereas the natural dunes measured at approximately 1.1 centimeters difference in erosion per week. Perhaps the biggest difference that we saw was in vegetation, at least initial difference. In Perseverance Dune, there is not much vegetation because of the fact that it was planted or constructed in 2021. So right now we see some spare Samopula, which is just American beach dune grass with various scattered plants around it. The plants are not doing so well because they're so new, so they haven't had time to develop and mature. Whereas in Kitchelingus, it's been there forever. There is high density of vegetation all over the dune system with a lot of Samopula, and a lot of other shrubs right by the nearby forest. And then orientation, as mentioned before, the artificial dune opens northwest, and then the natural dunes, most of them open west towards the lake shore.
So this graph here is looking at the grain size of the sand found in each dune here. There's 8 lines taken from 2 samples from each dune. And the red lines here are 2 samples taken from the Perseverance dune. So this line up here is taken from the top of the dune. The line on the bottom here is taken from the bottom of the dune. And before we even know what this graph is saying specifically, you can already see that there's a great difference between Perseverance and the natural blowouts here. And these differences are, this graph is looking at how large the grain sizes are. How that works is you have a sieve which traps grains of sand at different sizes. And as we go down here, we have less and less of the grains are getting smaller and smaller. And as we go down this y-axis, we have a smaller and smaller amount of sand still left in that sample. Right? And so as you can see here, the most interesting part of this graph is that all along here, these red lines are higher than the natural blowout samples, which is saying that the Perseverance sand is larger than the natural sand. And specifically here, this is very interesting because the sample taken from the top has smaller sand grains than the sample here at the bottom. And that's saying that we have already natural wind shaping that's pushing these larger grains to the bottom and keeping these smaller grains up at the top.
So here is a graph of the profiles of our chosen dunes. Taken with stadia rod readings, this is just showing essentially the side profile of our chosen dunes. Now, Perseverance here is in green, and it tracks essentially that this is just a pile of sand at this point. There has not been a whole lot of natural processes, especially with influencing the shape of this dune. As you can see up here, the slope angles are significantly steeper, largely due to the amount of wind pushing the sand. And then even though this one is significantly taller, we still see that this slope angle is incredibly higher than at Perseverance Dune.
All right, so our interpretation of this, there's significantly less vegetation on Perseverance Dune than at all of the 3 blowouts studied at Catchilungus. This loss of vegetation may be caused for the kind of gradual slope. And then with more time and the ability to develop, we believe that the vegetation on Perseverance Dune will mature. And we predict that the implementation of this vegetation will cause Perseverance Dune to become more natural in appearance, seeing as it's already doing that with the sand sediment sizes.
So, kind of returning to our original aim of this study is, what are some takeaways that we can use to improve Perseverance Dune to make it look more like a natural blowout? And we've kind of summed up our research into these 3 steps that we can take to make Perseverance more resemble natural dunes. The first of which would be stricter restrictions on the dune. This is in the effort to resemble that steeper slope angle. Right, as more traffic on the dune occurs, the sand is pushed down and the slope angle decreases. The second would be just more time given for these natural processes to take place. Right, that would also improve the slope angle. It would also improve the vegetation, which has very likely an effect on the slope angle as well. And third, native vegetation growth supplement, which would also affect where these sand grains are on the dune by trapping certain sand up there, which would also help with the slope angle.
So in conclusion, we can see that the 3 natural blowouts had larger grains of sand, steeper slope angles, and greater crest heights, and that we believe, given proper time and management, Perseverance Dune should more closely resemble a natural blowout dune.
We'd like to thank the Michigan Space Grant Consortium, Catchilungus, Parker Dune Preserve for allowing us to use the location, Calvin University for the funding and also the location, and our mentor Noah for all of his guidance and help in this project. Thank you all for your time.
Do you think in the future the wind will shape the preservation dune and make it more a steeper slope, or do you think human impact will negate the wind's impact?
That's a difficult question. Sorry, Catherine. It's just Perseverance Dune is already blocked by the Prince Conference Center. So if the wind is coming this way, Perseverance Dune is here and it already blocks the wind. So wind shaping probably wouldn't have that much of an effect.
Did you guys look at dominant wind direction relative to like the dune orientation?
We didn't. I mean, when you see that the dune is shaped directed in the way that it is, right, you can safely assume that the wind is coming towards the east if the blowout is facing west. So, because as Annika said, the Prince Conference Center is such a blockage of wind, we kind of focus less on wind because we would have a very hard time measuring it. It's just very negligible with Perseverance.
I was curious, however, to see where the wind was coming from. It was coming from south of the parking, like towards the parking lot. So the dune is actually essentially facing the wrong way. So over time, it may begin to actually form the opposite direction.
I don't quite remember if it was mentioned, but how did the physical sizes and dimensions of your blocks compare to each other?
Yes, so we did look for sizes that were of similar shape and size. Can I go back to the graph?
Sure.
So this map is proportional to this map as well. So you can tell that the dunes are of similar size. We tried to get them the
the blowouts as close to as they.
Any others? Yeah, I think.
Yeah, Sam, what you suggested about the wind direction also implies that maybe the dune could end up in Prince Pond. Wanted to prevent that. Do you have any specific recommendations for how many more feet of plants you might need to add to slow that down?
How many more?
Yeah, like comparing the vegetative cover of the natural dunes versus what you have created here on campus.
I don't know if I can put a number on it, but most of the natural dunes we observed had pretty sparse vegetation up to the crest, but then after that, we're almost entirely vegetated.
Yeah.
So what I'm assuming is holding a lot of that sand back from moving over is the vegetation density, because here, perseverance, we have like 2 or 3 plants per square meter, whereas out there it was almost complete vegetation coverage, even in a square meter.
Thank you. I didn't think this hit on you specifically. but
Of
you
course.
mentioned the wind. Yes.
Let's thank this research team. And as we transition, you can do a stretch that is a stretch as if a blowout dune is moving in the direction of your choice. Okay, so for our next presentation, we're going to go back to Hoffmaster State Park and continue what you've been learning about what's happening right along the lakeshore. So let's welcome our next team of presenters.
So I'm Grace Fuller, and this is Naomi Dupreez, and this is Brandon Huston. Today we're going to be talking to you about sand runs at PJ Hoffmaster State Park. Before we get into our research, I'm going to tell you a little bit about sand ramps. Both of these photos over here are of sand ramps. They are defined as sediment bridges that form between beaches and dunes, often following scarping, which we talked about in our first presentation. So you have the flat area, and then the steeper area, which is the sand ramp itself. And then on top, you have the scarp, which is the very steep vertical cliff-looking thing. Reaching your chest zone, showing that completed ramps play a significant role in beach dune sediment transfer. In other words, the ramps are important to seeing how the sand gets from the beach to the top of the dune. Not a ton of research has been done on sand ramps in the Great Lakes area. Most of the research that you can find on the Web of Science was done in France or Denmark, or there were a few studies far north in Canada. So our study was just looking at general characteristics of sand ramps in the Great Lakes environment. We wanted to know where sand ramps were forming at Hoffmaster, to what extent these sand ramps have developed, which would be how large they are relative to the scarp, and if there was evidence of beach dune sediment transfer, and also if there were other trends worth possible investigation.
Now, as Van Dyke had so nicely told you already, our study area was at Hoffmaster State Park, as you can see from this beautiful map right here. And our study area was along the lakeshore, right around here. And our area experienced severe scarping and foredune destruction due to high water levels between 2013 and 2020. So our methods was we use a GPS to measure across the lakeshore, and there was we measured all the different types of foredunes you would see. And so we have ramp formation, evidence of human impact, and many locations where measures were taken is what happened there with the GPS. Measures that we took in of the actual scarp was height, distance, slope, and scarp height. As this picture clearly shows up here, we have the ramp depth, which is the x-axis of the triangle. If you imagine a triangle as you're looking at this ramp, which is also scarp above the ramp, which is just sand that's piled up above this ramp. That's all that means. We got the ramp depth, ramp height, which is the y-axis, and then scarp height is the sand above it, and hypotenuse, which we're trying to get this low.
All right, so to get to our results, here we have a picture of another ramp for you, just a typical picture of a ramp at Hoffmaster State Park. And then here in this graph, it shows you how much of the beach actually had sand ramps. So about a third of it showed in the green had sand ramps. And then the orange areas did not show any sand ramps, but they did have scarp. And then the more blue area is where we did not find either of those. So then looking at our average sand ramp more in depth, the height we got from our measurements as the average was around 188 centimeters. And then the depth was around 281 centimeters. And so the height would be from the bottom, like behind where the scarp would be, to the top where the ramp actually meets the scarp. And then that depth would be from the bottom of the surface of the sand ramp going back to that same area. And then completion had an average of 84%. And so completion means out of the total height of the scarp, it was how much of it was covered with the sand ramp. And then here we have a picture of deposition, which we can clearly see as sand came and was blown by the wind and then deposited and started burying some of the plants. And we saw this deposition at the top of completed sand ramps on the ridge. And so we mostly found completed sand ramps in just various locations, or sometimes where there were trails, either nudged from people just walking up the ramp or managed trails. It completed the ramp with people kind of knocking that sort of down. All right, and so looking at our first graph here, you can see the height and area of the different measurements we took. So during our lab periods, we would walk down a section of beach. And so looking from north to south, or here north to south, you can see the different points along there and how they correlated with the area and height of the sand ramps we measured. So as you can see, both the height and the area started out low and then gradually got larger and then got to their peak around the main entrance, just to the left of the main entrance, which is between locations M and N. And then they were smaller on the other side. And both the height and the area correlated with each other.
the less completed the whole thing was. And so looking at the future, based off of this, we're likely to see the north end of the beach get completed sooner than the south end.
So our group found clear evidence of sand dune formation at PJ Hoffmaster State Park, as well as evidence of sand deposition where the ramps are forming, which corresponds with group 1 finding about slopes on the scarps. Although a minority of the ramps are complete now, the substantial formation seen, along with fast forming nature of sand ramps, suggests that we'll see a lot more of these ramps completing in the near future, provided that we don't have more scarping, and that sand ramp and its sand deposition will play an increased role in the Hoffmaster dune system. We would like to thank Calvin University and its Department of Geology, Geography, and Environmental Sciences, and PJ Hoffmaster State Park for hosting this opportunity. We'd like to thank Professor Van Dyke and our mentor, Kate Benedict, for their help, and the Michigan Space Grant Consortium for their funding, as well as you for coming and hearing our presentation. Are there any questions?
The ramp height plus the scarp height, the dune height?
Well, the full scarp height would be where the ramp is also, but then that was just the scarp at the top. And so the dune actually, sometimes it peaked at that point and then would go down, but then other times it kept going up. So it really depended on the feature.
Yes.
Just for clarification, how did you differentiate between the ramp and the scarp?
So the scarp is pretty much 90 degrees straight up. Like that is how scarp is by nature. The ramp is locations where there's areas that the sand has been pushed up. It's not like an area where something has been carved out.
For most of the ramps you saw, was it pretty clear where like the like intersection with the beach was, or were there some that were much more like harder to tell? That makes sense.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot that was hard to tell. It was sometimes just assumption, but most of the time you could get a close enough idea what was happening.
Just to add on to that, I guess sometimes there were parts where it seemed like there might be two ramps, one that was steeper and then a more gentle or sloped one, and then the that we measured from the initial ramp that we saw.
Any other questions? Well, let's thank this research team.
As we stretch between these next presentations, you can do so in the form of moving grains of sand, moving up a ramp. And on.
Lost the Wi-Fi for a second. We momentarily lost Wi-Fi. I think we're back on now. I see.
Stop or not
Yeah.
start?
We lost Wi-Fi, so it stopped. You did great. Yeah.
Well, I was like looking at my mom.
All right, we are ready for our next presentation. And we're going to take you away from the direct shoreline again, back into a blowout system, but there's some interesting things going on in this particular blowout system that you're about to meet. So let's welcome our next group of researchers.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out to our presentation today. I am Levi Leibel, Youngstown Lee, Jacob Fetter, and Thomas Smith. And today we'll be discussing the effects of erosion and deposition on a rare dune. So first, we have to figure out what the rare dune thistle is, and it is pitcher's thistle, scientific name Cirsium pitcheri. It is a plant native to the dunes of Lake Michigan and just the Great Lakes region in general. It is extremely sensitive to disturbances, so because of that, it is now listed as federally threatened in the United States. A general life cycle is it lives about 5 to 8 years, flowers once, and then it dies. So protection of it is really important because it only flowers once. So just a general age classification of it is we classify this as a baby C. pitcheri, this as a juvenile C. pitcheri, mature C. pitcheri, and then this right there is a dead C. pitcheri.
Following this information about C. pitcheri comes with the question of why it is important to protect the C. pitcheri species and what makes the plant species very unique in itself. Well, there are several reasons to explain on why this is the case, but one main reason of why we should protect this species is because that populations have been declining steadily through the past few years due to habitat loss. And this habitat loss is caused by the fact of constant sand erosion and other major and more severe factors such as constant recreational human activities and natural predators such as deer. In fact, our group established a deer camera or a trail camera in our research study area, and as you can see, we captured several pictures of deer, this being one of them. And it just goes to show that deer are there are presently a lot of natural predators that are posing a threat to the C. pitcheri species. And what makes the C. pitcheri species important and unique is the fact that it is a plant that really helps to stabilize the dunes by slowing down sand transportation, but also being a good food source for many animals such as birds and deer, as previously mentioned. Going to the main point of our research project comes with the research question, which is how does C. pitcheri react to varying depositional conditions? And these conditions come with three different factors, which are erosion, deposition, and sediment. Before conducting our research project, we came up with a couple of expectations. First of all, we expected to find more C. pitcheri in bare sand areas rather than in areas that have more vegetation. So in other words, we expected to find C. pitcheri populations in more open and empty areas rather than in places that are more vegetation dense and more competitive in terms of plant populations. And second of all, we expected to find more age diversity in groupings of C. pitcheri, being that we didn't expect to find large numbers of adult C. pitcheri rather than small numbers of baby C. pitcheri, but a good balance of the age diversity in C. pitcheri.
Our study objectives were to map every C. pitcheri in the study area, to map and measure areas of erosion and deposition, compare expectations with collected data and data from previous studies. Our study area was Rosie Mound Natural Area in Grand Haven, Michigan. The dune we were researching was a blowout within a parabolic dune system. Methods we used were GPS units to map and document the locations and age of C. pitcheri, along with the perimeter of the study area. We used erosion pins to measure erosion and deposition on the blowout. We used sand traps to measure sand transport. And we measured density and characteristics of vegetation using quadrats. Locations of erosion pins and sand traps. This is a satellite image of the dune. The blue diamonds are erosion pins. The purple diamonds are sand traps.
We have sand traps here, 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 here. The rest are erosion pins. Lake Michigan is to the west. This is the north arm. The crest is to the east, and this is the southern arm.
So we were very shocked throughout our study to find 1,009 individual sea petrite plants across the blowout. We found the largest number of babies at 333, and then it succeeded downwards with juveniles, mature, dead with flowers, and dead with no flowers. So very surprising results. We have our locations mapped of the different age categories. So you can see very specific groupings of different age categories. Babies have a specific grouping in the middle and on the southern arm, as well as the grouping on the crest. And this is generally followed with the juveniles, along with the crest, the mature, and then the dead with flowers, and some on the crest as well. And the dead without flowers, we didn't find very many across the dune. So there's very few grouping statistics for it. And comparing these results to the results from 2 years ago, we find that there's been a little bit of a change in locations across the dune of these groupings. In 2019, we see a large grouping in the middle and southern arm of the dune, whereas our results here show that same grouping, but a large grouping on the crest, which was not there before. In the 2019 data, these are dead plants, and there are only 3 juveniles mapped there, whereas there's a large population and diverse population on the crest, which is showing a shift in location across the blowout.
So as mentioned earlier, one of the things we studied was erosion deposition using erosion pins that we had set up. And then this is just a general graph of that. These numbers would be deposition, and then this would be erosion. The highest erosion that we measured was 0.03 meters, and the highest deposition was 0.02 meters. That is not very much erosion for deposition. And that could be contributed to, we just didn't have them set up very long. It was only a 3-week study. Or it could also show the dune stabilizing, because a more stabilized dune would have less erosion deposition than a less stabilized. We also set up sand traps to specifically collect sand to just get data on sand transport. So this is a graph showing the results of that. So in week 1, the sand traps were placed, so we didn't get any data from that week, of course. However, and then initially the traps were placed facing the west, because that's where we assumed most of the sand transport was going to be coming from. However, that was not the case, because our week 2 results were very minimal. So after we found that out, we decided to switch them to facing towards the northeast, towards week 3, and you can see how that really caused a boom in the amount of sand collected by these sand traps. We also did some vegetation surveys, specifically using quadrats. So that just the quadrant numbers and the type of cover, if it had shrubs or more grass, less grass. The number of species, that's counting sea petrite, but also Mopula, as mentioned earlier. The estimated percent covered by us, and then the number of sea petrite within the quadrant. And there's a couple trends we can find from this graph. First, is that in areas of lower percent cover, we see the greatest number of sea petrite. So this goes to show one of our expectations was we expect to find more sea petrite in areas of bare sand, and that kind of aids to that. And then the other takeaway is that it does not grow nearly as well in areas of higher percent cover. So with our 30% and 20% estimated percent cover, we see 0 sea petrite.
So over our study, we mapped over 1,000 sea petrite plants, which is very surprising. We were not expecting that. We found minimal changes in erosion and deposition across the dune, but we did find significant sea petrite groupings on the dune and a shift in those from previous studies.
Together, we would like to thank the Ottawa County Parks for allowing us to conduct this research project in Rosie Mountain Natural Area. We would also like to thank the Michigan Space Grant Consortium for providing us this grant, for making this research project possible. And lastly, we would like to thank the Calvin University Geo Department, especially Professor Deanna Van Dyke, and our mentor Isaiah Hageman for guiding us throughout this research project.
Thank you.
Yes, question up front.
the pitcher thistle at the top that you had previously found now, why do you think it was found here this year instead of 2019? And was it all juvenile, or was there an actual good mix of different age groups?
You're referring to the crest
Yeah.
grouping. So we only find a few, and these are juvenile. On the crest, these gray ones are dead there, and the quadrats are labeled in red. So you see a very small amount on the crest. And we're not sure exactly how it was. We don't know exact conditions for the crest area in the previous study, or how it's changed over the last 2 years, which is a long time for dune movement. But we do notice that a lot of the diversity has changed, and there is a significant and profound difference between them. And we can only wonder what will happen in the next several years with that population, and if it'll change locations to other parts of the dune as well.
A possible reason for that is in 2019, the crest was very unstable, so there was a ton of sand being moved across it, and that can make conditions for the pitcher thistle very just not ideal. And now in 2021, a possibility is that it is more stable, so the pitcher thistle is able to settle into that area and start to grow.
Question to that?
So how many quadrats did you, or how many samples did you take?
7 total.
Okay.
Yep. 7 total.
Question?
So a question for over here, Tyler, was it? Thomas. So explain me, how exactly does the sand trap work? I actually did not use the sand trap.
So essentially the sand trap has an opening. It's just like a PVC pipe, like a big one, and it just has an opening. And then the sand gets kind of obviously pushed by the wind into the sand trap, and it falls into a collection tube at the bottom.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I'm wondering if you could comment on the numbers that were counted in 2019 compared to your numbers. I'm not sure if you mentioned that number, but it's a significant difference. And I don't know if you'd like to speculate on what you would think in 2 years it might have difference.
Sure, yes. So the numbers for 2019, they mapped 444 compared to our 1009. So over 2 years, that is a large difference. We don't know exactly how it'll change over the next 2 years, because it does depend on so many factors changing and stabilization across the dune in different areas. And changes in stabilization may cause it to shift to a completely new area. So we don't know how many numbers we can find, but we can speculate that it'll increase by at least several hundred over the next 1 or 2 years. Yes.
This is just a question about the plant itself. I see that in the different keys on these graphs, you see there's flowering on the 2019 graph, and there's dead, and yours says flowered next to it. Does that mean as soon as the plant is flowered, it's already dead, or is there is it still alive while it's flowering? How does that process work?
Yeah, so when the plant matures, it is a monocarpic plant, so it flowers once and then dies after that season. So it'll flower in the spring, and the flower will last until the fall or until it frosts and gets cold enough to where the plant would normally go into kind of a dormant state and then come back the next spring. But instead of that, it flowers and exposes its seed, and it tries to multiply, and then it dies, and it does not grow back the next year. But it is still alive during that flowering phase. And on the graphs, we show the number that are dead with flower remnants or evidence of flowers on the plants, and then the dead without remnants or evidence of flowers on the plants, which is significantly lower than the ones with flowers on the plants. But we did not find any actual flowering plants at all throughout our study area. None of them
had flowers on them this year, which is very interesting.
Yes.
So question, since the deer picture is up there. Did you find that they were eating certain parts of the plants or targeting certain age classes? Because I think of thistles that you might run into in your garden. They're pretty unpalatable. I wouldn't think about eating them. It does seem like there seems to be significant deer browsing that you were talking about, that you've documented with multiple deer showing up in your plot. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what trends did you see?
So the effects of deer wasn't one of the main parts of our study, but one thing we did do, just kind of for curiosity's sake and for Isaiah's further research, was to map specific plants that had evidence of being eaten by deer. And mostly I think probably juvenile ones. Would you agree with that? It was mostly the juvenile plants we saw that had been eaten. And it was mostly just the leaves. Just the leaves part of it.
That's like the bottom inch or two of the leaves.
All right, let's thank this research team. Like a picture circle plant going through a 7-year cycle. Oh, there she goes.
No, let me see you as a flower.
Oh.
Oh my gosh, I'm crying. Oh my god.
Oh,
my
he's dead.
Oh, Mike's like.
All right, for our next presentation, we're going to take you back to the lakeshore and continue the story of what's happening along the lakeshore. And so let's welcome our research team who will tell us some more about that.
Well, thank you all for coming. My name is Seth Wright. My name is Nathan Disher.
My name is Cody Houston.
And I'm Avery Lewis. And over the past few weeks, our research team has been spending time looking for incipient foredunes on the Lake Michigan coast. A foredune is a shore parallel dune ridge. When you're walking from the water inland, it's going to be the first dune that you encounter in most cases. It's formed through Aeolian sand deposition, which is like the collection of sand or deposition of sand within vegetation and other sediment on the beach. An incipient foredune is a baby, or also called an embryo foredune. So that's what we were looking at, was the precursor to the foredune. And the inspiration for our study was the water levels that was mentioned in a previous group over the past few years of Lake Michigan. As you can see over here, so over the past 5 years or so, the lake levels have been extremely high, which has washed away the foredune and left very little beach space for sand movement by wind, and also has not encouraged vegetation growth. However, over the past year or so, the water levels are flowing back down. So we're taking the opportunity of the wider beaches to take some information down for future research, so we can have some documentation of the incipient foredunes. So the objectives of our study was to map the features of the beach, to document vegetation and sand deposits within our study area, and to predict where the incipient foredunes will be.
In order to fulfill the objectives that we set for ourselves, there were a number of variables that we had to measure, and those included the beach width, beach profiles, vegetation mapping, height and width of the sand deposits, and the locations of the vegetation and sand. And so while we were thinking about what methods would be the most beneficial for the amount of time that we had and the amount of research that we had to do, we decided that GPS and drone mapping, along with straight line surveys and ruler measurements, were going to be the most beneficial. So the GPS and drone mapping helped with mapping the beach features because we measured a number of transects along the beach just to measure the beach width. And so we were able to use line data on the GPS and pair that with some of the drone images that we took to get a better visual of what we were researching. And they were also helpful for documenting the characteristics of the vegetation and the sand deposits on the beach because we were able to use the GPS to get data points on where the vegetation was. And we were able to use data mapping software on top of the drone images to get a bird's eye perspective of what that might look like. And you'll see that in a moment. And for predicting the incipient foredune locations, we used primarily straight line surveys, which is where we used stadia rods and eye levels. And we measured along a transect on the beach, and we would measure different points along that transect. And what we measured was elevation change between each of those points. And, yeah.
Our study area was in the southern area of Hoffmaster State Park shoreline. So this area right around here. It's around this part of the mission.
All right, so we took a total number of 26 transects along the beach, and we GPS located them and then overlaid them onto our drone footage. On average, the beach width was 17.88 meters. We had a minimum beach width of 10.52 meters and a maximum beach width of 25.94 meters along these transects. And then we were also GPS located all of the vegetation we saw along the beach. A lot of it was Ammophila, and many of the plants were by themselves, but we did see some clustering of vegetation. And then after compiling all of our data, we created graphs for each of our profiles. And we found that in profile 21, 18, and 17, these were the best areas for incipient foredune growth because of the amount of vegetation in the area and the width of the beach.
So continuing our prediction, we predict that the incipient foredune will form on two different sides of our study area, the northern part and the southern part, for different reasons, because there are so many variables for incipient foredune growth. The northern end of the beach has, we measured wider transects of the beach, so there is a wider beach width, which allows for more of the saltation and movement of sand. And then towards the southern end is where we found all of the vegetation, which is really great for sand deposition for building the incipient foredune.
Well, we didn't have time to measure the water levels during our 3 weeks out at Hoffmaster. It is still a big contributing factor to the formation of the incipient foredunes because of the width of the beach. So if the water levels are higher, the beach is not as wide and there's less room for saltation and sand movement. But when the water levels are lower, there's a lot more room for that saltation, and there's also room for possible vegetation growth.
In conclusion, our first objective was, on average, the beach was 18 meters wide. And the width of the beach of northern end of Hoffmaster was much wider than the southern end. Our second objective was that clusters of vegetation were found towards the southern end of the park, with sand deposits forming around. And our third objective was that we predicted incipient foredune locations in the northern part park because of the huge beach width, and the southern part of the park there will also be incipient foredunes forming because of the abundance of vegetation already there. I'd like to thank the professor who was really great in this, and our mentor Addison, and the Michigan Space Grant, my bad, sorry, and the employees in Hoffmaster State Park.
I know the first week when we were out there, it was not the best weather, and the levels were pretty high up on the beach. So do you think that affected the event?
So the first week there were only 2 of us there because of sickness, so it made it even harder. And it was pretty windy, so there was a decent amount of waves. So I ended up having to get into the lake a little bit to kind of measure, based on where the waves were like starting to break and everything. We kind of started measuring there, so that's how we kind of met it.
Is there any like future research or studies that you think your like results would point towards? Or yeah, so we're hoping that because we only had like 3 weeks to do the research,
It wasn't quite enough time to track all of like the variables that go into incipient foredune growth, and also it should be studied over a longer period of time just because how it can be. So we're hoping that our information will be available for future research groups, and if the like levels continue to go down, which obviously we can't totally predict, but we can hope that if the levels continue going down, there will be more opportunity to research the incipient foredune and then eventually the foredune at PJ Hoffmeister.
Could you guys define for me saltation?
Essentially, it's when sand is kind of moved by the wind, so it can be lifted up and then it'll move, it'll fall back down to the sand dunes, and it can start building up a little bit more, which is what starts forming the sediment.
All right, let's thank this research. As tempting as it is to for me to make you stretch a form of saltation, which would be hopping around the room right now, I'll just let you take a stretch that's maybe a little bit more gentle while we're transitioning to our last research.
One stretch.
Yeah. I'm gonna prank call your dad again. And tell him I said that. Hey, you guys did really good.
All right. We will move on to our last presentation, which takes us into some different areas of the dune system and brings some elements that we've heard about before, like the deer, but also a few new elements in. So let's welcome our last set of presenters.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. My name is Carissa, and my research team is Lucy, Brayden, and Charlie. So over the past couple of months, we've been comparing dune characteristics and also deer populations on 3 different dunes along Lake Michigan. So a little bit an introduction about our study is first, Professor William Miller did a study over 2020 and 2021, and his team conducted tick surveys at 3 different locations. So here you can see this is him and 2 of the people that he worked with doing a tick study while we're out there at the same time. So the number of ticks varied between the 3 different parks or the 3 different locations, and part of the reason that this could be is because of soil characteristics such as like how moist the soil is, vegetation, and the presence of deer. So for our study, we were seeing what could affect the deer numbers, and yeah.
So the question for our research is, what are some of the distinct differences between dune characteristics in 3 Ottawa County parks? Basically, we want to find these differences so we could, as Chris was saying, find out why the number of ticks varied. So then the study objectives were to analyze the dune characteristics for the 3 sites, measure the deer presence at the 3 locations. So here are 3 locations along the coast of Michigan. We have Rosie Mound Natural Area, Kirk Park, and Olive Shores. And so these are 3 locations. This is Rosie Mound Natural Area where the picture thistle research is being done. And so as you can see, they're all relatively close together, but they all vary differently. So that's why we're trying to find the characteristics that change that.
So for dune characteristics, we measured moisture content. We took 4 samples from each site, and we tried to take these 4 samples in representative areas. We weighed the samples before and after oven drying, and then we used some math to calculate the moisture percentage by math. We also completed dune features inventories on November 4. The DFIs are just checklists of dune structure, activity, ecology, and human impacts is just to provide a general overview of what's going on and who is at those dunes. We also calculated percent forest cover with Arcgis Online. You can see that's an image of this here, where we use the area mapping tool to measure the approximate area and percentage of area that is covered versus uncovered by trees. We also measured deer presence. We estimated deer population with the use of trail cameras like this one. Thank you to Professor Miller for providing the trail cameras. 3 cameras were placed in each park. We tried to spread them out evenly again from October 21 to November 4. And then the Jacobson method was used to estimate population sizes. That's just a method that uses the number of branch antlered identifiable bucks to estimate the size of other groups and then the size of the total population. We also measured deer presence with GPS units by marking trails, tracks, rubs, scrapes, feces, and any of the deer sign.
All right, so this is a list of gene characteristic results that we got. So I'll go through them. So they were pretty similar across the board, but there were some differences. All had a dune ridge and had a parabolic dune. The one difference was that Rosie Mound had a blowout. This for the percentage of tree cover, because it had a blowout, it kind of affected that. As we see, Kirk Park and Olive Shores are very similar with their tree coverage, while Rosie Mound is significantly, about 10% smaller. We also measured sand moisture content. And as you can see, Kirk Park had a lot higher moisture content. The other two were pretty similar. And we also measured dominant vegetation community, and they were all the same across the board with the deciduous forest and bluegrass. So after looking through our pictures of the deer cameras, we estimated that Rose Mound had about between 30 and 40 deer. So we can't get exact, but it is possible. It's very close. Kirk Park had about 10, and Olive Shores had between 15 and 16.
So one of the ways that we measured deer presence was talking about deer signs. Here are some different examples of the deer sign. We have deer rub, which is just signs of scraping along different wooded areas or in dirt, different deer prints, and then we also saw deer trails as well as deer feces that were flat. Here is just some GPS mapping of the different fishing patterns that were found on across the 3 different sites. Kirk Park was noticeably less in the amount of signs that we saw. And Rosie Mound Natural Area had a lot more concentrated in those different signs. Like if you saw one scrape, you were bound to see lots of trails nearby. One thing to note was that Olive Shores was a little difficult to track using GPS because all of the signs were so spread out, and if we were to map it, the entire thing would be covered, and it would be impossible to tell what was going on.
So our deer population estimates correlated with the track time of all summer 2021 tick counts. That's Professor Miller's study. And they found the highest tick counts in Olive Shores with 114.71 black-legged ticks per 1,000 meters squared, followed by Rosie Mound with 44.67 and Kirk Park with 9.84. This trend, this pattern is mirrored in our deer population estimates. But we did not find significant evidence of a relationship between studied dune characteristics and cat time at all.
So in conclusion, some of the biggest differences we found was that Rosie Mound had the least amount of forested area. Kirk Park had the greatest sand moisture. Olive Shores host the greatest deer population. And so this shows that all the locations were similar, including stuff with vegetation. They were similar, but we couldn't really find a great correlation between this and then the TIC data. We're hoping that in the future, this data can be used to help.
We would like to thank Professor William Miller, Professor Van Dyke, and Ms. Tom for their support, as well as the Michigan Space Grant Consortium and the Calvin Department of Geology, Geography, and Environmental Sciences for funding and for their support as well. And we would like to thank our university for the this opportunity, as well as the Ottawa County Parks for their support and the allowance of us to be there. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, we use Arcgis, so it's satellite images, and then you can area map. You can usually, bare areas you can tell from an overhead view. And then calculate the percentage.
Can you guys talk a little bit more about why it and your populations would be correlated?
Yeah, we did some research before this in order to prepare to go out to these locations, and it was shown that deer are one of the highest animals to transport ticks, and that ticks like to hold on to move, as well as I believe it was mice with it. Yeah, but that's a lot more difficult to track. So we focused mainly on deer because those were a lot more obvious signs and easy to find those.
From like the deer photos, how many times have you known that comes in deer over?
That's good. Well, there's a couple ways to answer it. First, we split every photo is timestamped. So you could generally tell when you had like 4 successive photos of the same deer, because the timestamps are really close to one another. So we used a 10-minute, just a difference to make sure we weren't counting the same deer. Also, a little bit of that is accounted for in the calculation, and it's somewhat unavoidable.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could explain what that method of calculation was, just a little bit.
Okay, so it's based off of the number of identifiable deer, and that's generally mature males or mature males. So they have branched antlers, and those are more easy to identify and define individuals more than really any other feature, because pretty much every doe looks the same. And so using that number and then what's called the incidence rate, so that's how many times you actually saw a branched antler buck. You then use some ratios to determine the number of spike antler bucks, because they're not easily identified, and the number of antlerless deer. And then you can add that all together to get a final population estimate.
Oh, that's easier. Once you have limited equipment, how did you determine the best spot to put the cameras so you can capture as many deer as possible? You don't have it.
Yeah, we followed a little bit with Professor Miller's where he collected the ticks and where he counted the ticks. We followed along that, so we basically tried to place them. Okay, let me go back to that. They're the purple dots, so we tried to place them right behind the actual the foredunes. So they were off of the beach for the most part, into the forested areas, and we had them facing away from the dunes so we could see where their trails are. We also tried to, as we were going through, we looked for different deer signs. So if we saw lots of trails going one way, we're going to point at the trails so that we can actually capture the deer on the path that they would go on, rather than places where we see that they have been.
Another thing is we tried like covering the entire park. So we tried like going from end to end, but also spacing them out evenly throughout the 3 different parks that we did.
So since you're on this picture, this is really cool. I don't see things from the overhead. So I'm thinking about your deer densities in each of these parks and what that might mean for tips on the ground. What about human influences? So looking at Kirk Park, could that have a relationship with how deer are potentially using space? Because if you're in the park, all of them look the same. But if you look at the surrounding area, they seem quite different. Olive Shores has a lot of like 3 or 4 acre parcels surrounding it versus Kirk Park. What do you think about that as a potential reason why deer might be using space differently?
Yeah, that's definitely could be happening. Like you said, Kirk Park is really surrounded by human impacts, human properties, human residences, whereas the other 2 have a little bit more forested area around them. And so that might have been why we saw more deer and why we saw more deer moving through, because they might just be moving around those areas, especially during the rut. So does that answer the?
Yeah, so you're on the ground kind of observations driving between the parks. Does that kind of line up with what you see from the overhead image? Because, you know, okay.
Yeah, Perth is definitely surrounded by humans more than.
Okay.
And even the design of each of the parks, we did this a little bit in the Dune feature inventories, talking about how Kirk Park had a lot more trails through things for people to go on, as well as Kirk Park had a lot more picnic benches and different places to sit down and to enjoy. So it felt like Rosie Mound was a general go see the Dune and head back. Same with Olive Shores was going to go down to the beach and come back, but Kirk Park was allowing people to walk through the actual forest a lot more. So that might also have impacted your one stay with this.
Let's thank this